Welcome. You're at the Town of Litchfield PFAS informational meeting. Thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for the opportunity to bring a PFAS update to you. It looks like most attendees have joined us. There will probably be still a few coming in, so I'm going to get started with some housekeeping items. I'm Amy Rousseau. I'm the PFAS response administrator for the Department of Environmental Services. So I oversee some of the PFAS initiatives that are going on amongst the programs here at the DES. And I also administer some of the PFAS specific funds and loans that we have. So tonight, this meeting is being recorded, and you will have an opportunity to get access to the video after this presentation. All attendees have been muted upon entry. If you're having any technical difficulties with the platform, please call or email Erin Holmes at erin.holmes, ERIN.HOLMES at des.nh.gov, or you can call her at 603-271-8321.
Amy?
Yes.
I just wanted to, that I'm using my work cell phone. So for anybody who might have an issue, it's best to email me at the email address below, but I will also send my work cell in the chat. And so if you want to jot that down, if you're having an issue, feel free to call my cell as well. So I'll just put that in the chat to the audience.
All right, thanks, Erin. I forgot you weren't in tonight. Some handouts have been included in your dashboard. So you'll see on the dashboard, there should be a handouts tab. In that tab, you'll find the slides for the presentation and some other informational handouts as well. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. Just a few notes, if you are just calling in, you're in listen-only mode and you will not be able to communicate with the panel during the meeting, which means you will not be able to ask your question live. If you do want to be able to do so, you could get in touch with Erin and she can get you registered and into the meeting platform. We're going to ask that you use the question function to type your name to be added into a queue, and we'll go through that queue later. At the end of the presentation, Erin will go through some further instructions as to how you can get into the queue to ask your questions. All right. So to get started, I do apologize. We are having some technical difficulties with a few of us. Our cameras are not working. So I do apologize for that. My camera is not working. And then Mike Wimsatt's going to be our first speaker tonight with some PFAS background and history. And his camera is also not working. And then we're going to move on to some health effects with Jonathan Ali. And then move into the PFAS investigation with some more details about some sampling, occurrence, and notification and results. And that will be with Jeff Martz from the Hazardous Waste Bureau. And then we're going to move into our question and answer session. And so during this period, we also are going to have Amy Doherty from the Hazardous Waste Bureau from the state sites, and Kathy Beam from AIR, and Brandon Kernan is joining us from Drinking Water. So they will also be on the panel to ask any questions. All right, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Director Mike Wimsatt. And again, I apologize, he has no camera feature at this time either.
Thank you, Amy, and good evening. And yeah, we're very sorry we don't have our camera, just so that you can see who's talking. It's a little more personal that way, but nonetheless, I hope everyone can see the slides and will hear us reasonably well. And I think we'll have a productive evening. We really want to focus our time here on your questions and issues that are specific to your community in Litchfield. But we also want to make sure that all the participants who are here tonight or participating have a basic knowledge of the PFAS topic, how we got to where we are today. So I'm going to briefly review what PFAS are and review the history of this contamination that has occurred in southern New Hampshire, and then talk a little bit about how that translated into a consent agreement with Saint-Gobain and how we're implementing that. So the next slide, just to to give you an idea, and some of you have probably heard this before. I apologize, the slide changing is going a little faster than expected. So PFAS are, the main thing to keep in mind about PFAS, they are synthetic compounds. They were developed in the late 1940s. They are completely man-made. They do not occur in nature. And basically they contain, it's really organic compounds, carbon chains that contain multiple fluorine atoms. And this is no news to the folks in Litchfield, that the two most studied PFAS are perfluorooctanoic acid, or PFOA, and perfluorooctane sulfonate, or PFOS. And of course, the contaminant that is of most concern in southern New Hampshire that was emitted by air emissions by Saint-Gobain was perfluorooctanoic acid, or PFOA. But these compounds are really a group of a much larger family of thousands of pretty diverse compounds. And they really, this sort of family tree of PFAS is something that we try to explain to people, because there's so many acronyms, it gets confusing to people. So you'll see, first of all, we'll start with the sort of apple that fell from the tree, and that's the PFC on the ground there. That's the term we were using when we first discovered this problem. It stands for perfluorochemicals, and that's a subset of the larger PFAS group, which contains both the perfluoroalkyls and the polyfluoroalkyls. And then if you look up at the rest of the tree, PFOA is the one that we, again, are most concerned about in southern New Hampshire. PFOS is one that is often associated with firefighting foams. And then PFNA and PFHXS are two other compounds that we currently have standards for that are related to those, although we don't see them in evidence a lot in southern New Hampshire. So that's just to give you an idea. We are trying to use, right at the trunk there, the term PFAS, which is really the most inclusive term, and that helps us sort of be inclusive when we're talking about these issues. So PFAS, since they've been developed, they are very unique compounds because they have both the unique ability to repel water and also to repel grease and oils. And you don't see that very often with the same molecule. And as a result, they've found so many uses, both in consumer products as well as in industrial uses. So you can see a whole bunch of things there on that table that they're used in and they're in the formulations of. And the one that we'll focus on a little bit tonight is over on the lower right, where it says textiles, upholstery, apparel, and carpets, because Saint-Gobain essentially coats textiles with a Teflon product, and they use PFAS in the emulsions that are used to coat those fabrics. And PFOA previously was in a significant component of the emulsions that they used, and that was what resulted in the air emissions when they basically heat up those fabrics in ovens, and the heated fraction is drawn off and emitted through their stacks. So the discovery of PFOA contamination in southern New Hampshire occurred in about very early March of 2016. Saint-Gobain had other facilities in New York State and in Vermont, and basically had discovered just in the weeks previous to that they had PFOA contamination in drinking water in those communities. So they tested the drinking water coming into their facility, which actually was provided by the Rimat Village District. So it was a public water system that provided them with their drinking water at their plant. And they essentially found about 30 parts per trillion in that MVD supplied water. So they notified the department, and really we started taking immediate steps to sample both public and private drinking water wells in the vicinity of the plant. That quickly spread through the data we were getting to really have to expand considerably, till we actually looked across the river in Litchfield and found a lot of contamination in private drinking water wells. And that's when this airborne transport pathway really became evident to us, because we didn't see a practicable way where groundwater transport from the other side of the river would have the ability to contaminate the wells that we were seeing contaminated in Litchfield. So our testing expanded very rapidly, and I'm sure for many people on this call that is no news, because if you're a resident of Litchfield, you may have lived that. And we had really significant impacts to drinking water wells in a 5 or 6 town area, including drinking water wells in Litchfield. So that really led to a massive outreach campaign and further sampling effort that really continues to this day. Public and private water supplies were sampled. We had DES sampling teams knocking on doors. So we used GIS and mailings and telephone to try to reach out to as many people as we could. And the short-term solution was really just to get people safe, clean drinking water right away through the provision of bottled water. And then the long-term solution was to try to make arrangements for alternate water, which in most cases meant expansion of public drinking water systems into the impacted areas where previously people who had been served by private drinking water wells. And that meant some large-scale waterline projects that were funded by Saint-Gobain. And those, as many of you know, took a few years to develop and get completed. So the waterline extensions that have been planned and designed have essentially been completed and are built, and the people in Litchfield that are being served by those are already connected. But we are sampling further, and there is Saint-Gobain is conducting sampling in areas that have not yet been served by public water, and alternate water planning is still ongoing. So I want to talk a little bit about the consent decree. So basically, as we were, we made Saint-Gobain aware early on that they were going to be responsible for providing both short-term and long-term alternate water. And we negotiated an agreement whereby they would get that done. And so one of the things we did first was there was an area, a more concentrated area around the plant that clearly had contamination above the action level that we were looking at the time, which was 70 parts per trillion. And so we drew kind of a red line around that. It was called the pre-groundwater management zone. And a GMC is just it's a name that describes an area that where groundwater is impacted above standards. So there was this area where we were very confident from our sampling that groundwater was impacted above standards throughout that area. And the agreement required that they provide alternate drinking water within that area almost uniformly. And then there was also an outer boundary that was drawn that was further afield, farther away from the plant than that. And that was to demarcate, as part of the agreement we made, is anything outside that outer boundary, they would be responsible for testing and providing alternate water for properties or wells that were above 70 parts per trillion, but the agency would not be in a position to compel them to provide alternate water for impacts that were below 70 parts per trillion. And then the area in between, the donut, if you will, between sort of the red line and the blue line, and I should show you a diagram because that'll help explain it. So this red line is the pre-GMZ, and inside there, significant expansion of public drinking water systems was completed. And as you can see, with the river running down the middle, significant areas of Litchfield were included in that. And then the blue line is this outer boundary. And outside that, again, they're responsible if they have impacts above 70 parts per trillion. But in the area between the red line and the blue line, which we call the outer boundary of the CD, of the consent decree, basically the agency retains all of its own authorities. Original authorities under the law. So it can request and require Saint-Gobain to perform sampling of drinking water wells. And where those wells are above our current standards, whether it's, which have been lowered, and we'll talk about that in a moment, we can still ask that they provide alternate water. So it's important to note that all areas of Litchfield are actually within the CD outer boundary. So really anywhere in Litchfield where a drinking water well is impacted above standards, we are looking to Saint-Gobain to the extent that we identify that contamination is a result of their releases. We are asking them to both sample and provide alternate water. So let's talk about the drinking water standards. So again, in just a month after discovery, we were pressing EPA at the time. They had some provisional standards for both PFOA and PFOS that were set, very high. And so we were around 200 and 400 parts per trillion. We were using what New York State at the time was using as a guideline of about 100, but we were pressing EPA because we knew that they were doing a lot of work to try to develop a more reliable and updated standard based on the toxicology and the science. So they did that work, and around mid to late April, they did identify 70 parts per trillion as a standard for both PFOA and PFOS, either separate or combined concentration. We initiated immediately an emergency rulemaking to set our ambient groundwater quality standard, which is an enforceable standard, at that 70 parts per trillion. And then as more information became available and the New Hampshire legislature made it clear that they wanted us to look at the new information and set a standard based on all the new science that was being developed. So after doing that, we promulgated rules that were effective September 30th of 2019, which set the standards, which we'll talk about a little bit later or in the next slide. But and that rulemaking established both ambient groundwater quality standards, which is the standard we use to regulate contaminated sites, and a drinking water MCL, which is an enforceable standard applicable to public water systems. But right after, like one day after that rulemaking became effective, 3M Corporation and the Plymouth Village Water District filed a lawsuit seeking a preliminary and a permanent injunction to bar DES from enforcing that standard. That preliminary injunction was granted by the Rimat County Superior Court at the end of December of that year, and so then that meant that we could not enforce those standards. By July of 2020, the legislature passed a law that established the standards as a matter of law, and they became effective in July of 2020 upon the governor's signature. Now, the standards that we're now enforcing are both drinking water MCLs as well as ambient groundwater quality standards for 4 PFAS compounds. The most notable one for the folks in your community is the one for PFOA, which is set at 12 parts per trillion. So quite a bit less than the original 70 that we had been working with a few years earlier. And then you can see the standards for the additional compounds there. So that's really a whirlwind tour of the history of the Southern New Hampshire PFAS contamination problem and the regulatory history of how we got to where we're regulating them. I want to now turn it over to Dr. John Alley, who's going to talk a little bit about PFAS exposure and the health risks associated with that and try to answer some questions. So John, I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect, thanks Mike. And I'm gonna see if I have control of the slides yet. Looks like I do, great. So before I get too much going into my presentation, if any of the other speakers could either wave me down or interrupt me. I've been having some internet connectivity issues today. So if this turns into garbled messaging, just let me know and I'll turn off my video and that should fix it. So hi, my name is Jonathan Alley. I'm the toxicologist for the Department of Environmental Services, and in my role as the toxicologist, I help the agency understand risk from exposure and potential health outcomes associated with PFAS and other chemicals. This program within DES also works with our partners at the New Hampshire Department of Public Health Services, so I can try to help answer some questions, or if there's questions tonight that can't be answered by me, I can bring those back to our partners there. And we also work with the CDC branch called the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. And through a special grant program, they afford us additional staff to help with community concerns related to environmental exposures. So Mike went over a presentation of what PFAS are, and from a health perspective, we're concerned about exposure to PFAS and the resulting health effects. So to start with, the main way that you're exposed to PFAS chemicals can be through your ingestion of them. So this could be in either drinking water or in contaminated food. So in drinking water, we have a lot of studies that show us if you have elevated concentrations in drinking water, it'll elevate the concentrations of these chemicals in your blood. That's why we set a standard for them, is to reduce your exposure to protect health. But these chemicals are also found in certain food items. A lot of the PFAS, like PFOA and PFOS, have historically been phased out, so they're not as present in certain food items. But depending on certain food packaging or where things are grown, they may contain some trace levels of these chemicals. We also know that these chemicals can pass across the placenta and into infants or fetuses, and that they can also be transferred in breast milk. And this was a key reason that we lowered the AGQS and MCL from the EPA advisory, was trying to account for this transfer where children are born with a certain amount of PFAS in their blood, and they may be further exposed if there's elevated concentrations in breast milk. There may be some risk from inhalation exposure or accidentally ingesting dust that contain PFAS. So we do know from their use in a lot of commercial and household products that some of the dust that's generated can actually contain these PFAS chemicals. So if you don't regularly change out your air filter and keep dust levels low, you may be inhaling some of that and getting some exposure that way, or by accidentally swallowing it as it enters your airway and your throat. This can also be a way that children might be exposed. So small infants that crawl around on carpeted surfaces that may have been historically treated with some of these products, they go to put either their hand in their mouth, or if they touch a toy and stick that in their mouth, we call that a hand-to-mouth behavior, and that's a way that they may have some exposure. So certain PFAS are less efficiently absorbed across skin. So typically when we think of the PFAS that we've set standards for, the primary concern is for their ingestion. So if you're eating them in either food or in drinking water that you're consuming, not so much skin contact. While a very small amount may be absorbed across skin, you would need much higher concentrations in water to present a risk to skin contact. But the chief reason that we're concerned about these chemicals that we set standards for are they're bioaccumulative. So certain PFAS, specifically the ones we have standards for, will build up in your body over time. And that's why we have a regulation or standard that is down in the parts per trillion or nanogram per liter, is to account for that, because they can build up over time in the body. It takes several years for your body to eliminate these. So those limits are listed here. They're separate for each of these compounds because we picked the most sensitive effects for these, and they don't all line up. So for PFOA, we base this on potential risk to liver toxicity and liver damage. For PFOS, alterations in the immune system. PFNA is impacts to pregnant women or the fetuses, and specifically their liver function. And for PFHXS, it's a risk of harm to either the ovaries or the reproductive system of women. So these limits, though, were set specifically considering a couple of things, and this is dictated to us by the legislature. So we're trying to account for pregnant and lactating women and their infants, those same individuals who consume a very high volume of water on a daily basis, and those with chronic exposure. So they're using this water for several years to decades. And then we also wanted to account for those other sources of exposure. So arguably the numbers could be higher, but we know that since PFAS comes from other sources, we wanted to account for that. We give a buffer so that way, even if you're getting it from food, dust, or other places, the drinking water level is still protective for your health. So for more information, the technical studies that were used to develop these numbers, there is a link listed here. You're more than welcome to go through and read that. But when we think about the health effects of PFAS, the chief things that we're concerned with and have been identified by the CDC are increases in cholesterol levels, changes in some liver enzyme levels, subtle changes to an infant's birth weight, alterations in immune function or maybe how it responds to infections, some increased risk of preeclampsia in pregnant women, some changes in thyroid hormones or reproductive hormones like testosterone and estrogen. And in certain populations with considerably high exposures, there is suspected a risk of certain cancers, but this is still somewhat debated in the literature. Right now, this is being studied nationwide by academic groups at universities who are studying different communities, but also the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry is conducting a nationwide study at multiple sites where people have been exposed to PFAS through drinking water. And the goal of this nationwide study is to try to understand what the risks are, what the health outcomes might be, and what recommendations can be given to physicians. The study started last year. They are still collecting data, so it may be some time before they have conclusions, but the goal is for this study to be applicable to everyone in the United States that has been exposed to PFAS compounds. This is a constantly evolving area of research, so you can go online. If you look up studies or just Google PFAS, you will find a lot of different information that comes up. Some studies are better than others. It just depends on what they're looking at. So this is constantly evolving. ATSDR does keep track of this, as well as several agencies, and more information can be found at the link below. So I wanted to go through some commonly asked questions that we get, just so that way we can sort of address those early on. If anyone has follow-up questions during the Q&A session, we'll be happy to answer those. One of the questions is, where can my physician learn more about PFAS and my family's risk? So understandably, in several communities, including Litchfield and Rimat, folks have had questions for their physicians of, what does this mean for my health? What does this mean for my family's health and in the long run? There has been information that has been developed to try to help physicians understand this. But again, this is still an evolving area of research. So it may be hard for physicians to have concrete conclusions to draw right now, but there are resources for them to review. And if they want to get more information and learn a little bit more, they can do that. And those resources are available at these links below. They're also always happy to just take a phone call and we can try to connect them with the resources ourselves. There's also a common question of, is there a test to measure PFAS in my blood? So as I mentioned early on, there's PFAS in your water, PFAS in your environment. You're probably accumulating this in your blood. There are tests to do this. And the same legislation that passed our MCLs and codified them into law last summer also required health insurance companies to pay for PFAS blood testing. So the answer is yes, there is PFAS blood testing, and yes, it is required to be paid for by insurance. But we always try to warn people that it may only give you a number, and that may be challenging for a physician to interpret, and they may have different thoughts on what's appropriate for patient care. So it's a conversation that you want to have with your physician to see if this is something that you're wanting to pursue, if you want to get more information about. Again, there is information out there. We're happy to share that with physicians or practitioners that want to learn more. So we also get questions of, can I cook with the water? And at this time, if your water is above the standards for drinking that were established last summer, we recommend using an alternative source of water for cooking as well. So as I mentioned before, these are easily absorbed through ingestion. So if you're drinking the water, that's ingestion. If you cook with the water, then you'll actually possibly cook some of these compounds into the food. And again, that's ingestion. So that increases your risk for exposure. And furthermore, boiling water will not remove these compounds out. People ask if they can use the water for bathing, showering, or cleaning. The standards were developed for use of drinking water. So for these other sources, the criteria does not address those specifically. Or as we mentioned before, there is the sort of issue of at lower levels and some of the ranges that we see in parts of the state, you would need much higher amounts of PFAS to present significant risk through skin contact. So these criteria that we developed are specifically for drinking, not for bathing. People also ask, can we irrigate our home lawns, or can we use it for growing vegetables and produce? With PFAS, this is a new area of research that folks are trying to understand how these chemicals might be taken up into vegetables, produce, fruit, items like that. We know other chemicals like heavy metals can be transported through soils, and other contaminants that have been studied for a long time can be transported through soils into certain produce. But with PFAS, this is still an evolving area of research, and we really don't understand how much of that can be taken up. It does appear that some of them have a better ability to be taken up depending on the product, but we still don't know enough to make definitive conclusions. So for anyone that wants more information about studies on this topic or to learn more, again, we're happy to provide information, and just use my contact information at the end of this presentation. Same thing with irrigating lawns. Folks will ask that, and they ask if there's a residue from these chemicals on my grass, is it okay for my children, myself, or pets to play or come in contact with grass? Skin contact's not the primary route of exposure, but our criteria were not developed for this specific use. And furthermore, if you are going to be doing anything along those lines, you always want to check if you're using any kind of lawn care products that you're also being mindful that you can have exposures to other contaminants or irritants that way. People ask if they should be concerned about their pets. And we don't have a lot of information at this time for other species that haven't been studied. So things like cats, dogs, and certain aquatic organisms. So like pet fish or things being kept in aquaria. What we do know is humans are pretty unique in their ability to bioaccumulate and retain these for several years to decades in their body. Other animals don't seem to follow that trend, but we also know that from the use of other commercial products and other items, pets could be exposed through other ways. So as I mentioned before, if you have upholsteries, fabrics, things like that that have been treated with PFAS and pets roll around on that and then groom themselves, they could be exposed to certain compounds that way, including other non-PFAS chemicals. What you should do is if you have a concern, speak with your veterinarian first and let them know that you have a concern about this issue. And if they would like technical information, we're happy to be a route for them to get connected to that. We can let them know what is known, what is not known, and they can make a medical decision based on what they know about your pet's history and its health. Now, one of the other questions that we get is, are there limits for PFAS other than these 4? And at this time, no. We're still trying to gather information to understand which of these chemicals can we develop an accurate number to protect human health without, one, crying wolf and raising alarm where there may not be as much risk. But 2, we don't want to jump the gun and tell people that it's safe without really being sure that we're close as possible to protecting everyone in the population. So with that, I'll put up my contact information. If you have any other questions about exposure or environmental health impacts, please feel free to contact me. I can put you in touch with my program at DES, as well as folks at DHHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, if you have additional questions. And with that, I will turn it over to Jeff.
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Just going to be taking control of the screen here. So my name is Jeff Martz. I'm a senior hydrogeologist with the NHDES Hazardous Waste Remediation Bureau. So the Hazardous Waste Remediation Bureau is tasked with providing regulatory oversight for the investigation and remediation and management of contaminated sites where PFAS chemicals are involved. So I'll be talking tonight about PFAS sites, drinking water sampling, and PFAS occurrence in the town of Litchfield. So here is a map showing the town of Litchfield outlined in yellow. The surrounding towns are covered with a blue just to mask them a little bit. And I'm going to be talking about the St. Gobain area that Mike Wimsatt touched on early in his talk, and discrete PFAS sites. And by discrete PFAS sites, I mean sites where there's a localized source of PFAS on site, often either spilled to the ground or emitted through the floor of a facility. And the resulting contamination in groundwater is relatively confined to a small area, sometimes confined just to the site itself, occasionally extending off-site, involving a handful of wells to maybe tens of wells. But in the case of Litchfield, there are actually no identified discrete PFAS sites identified by these little stars. You can see there's no stars present within the town. There are a few in surrounding towns, but none in the town of Litchfield. But the St. Gobain facility, which is identified by the star in the northern part of, or the top of this map, is where air emissions from the facility occurred that moved with the air and were deposited on parts of the town. And you can see the pre-GMZ I've illustrated here by the red line that Mike discussed. So this encompasses the area where water lines were extended to address wells that were over 70 parts per trillion for PFOA. And then finally, I'll point out the St. Gobain consent decree outer boundary. That's this blue line, which follows the southern boundary of the town of Litchfield with Hudson. So the entirety of the town of Litchfield is either within the pre-GMZ or the St. Gobain outer consent decree boundary. So, you know, we've talked about this idea of air emissions as the primary reason that Litchfield is talking about St. Gobain. And as Mike mentioned, St. Gobain is a fabric coater, and they have a process where they dip rolls of fabric through pans that are filled with chemicals that contain, among other things, PFAS. And after the fabric is dipped, it goes up into a vertical oven where it's heated to dry the fabric. And the exhaust from those ovens vent through the roof through a series of stacks. And the emissions from those facilities are transported with the wind across the river, across the Merrimack River, and in some cases have been deposited as either wet deposition or dry deposition. So wet deposition being rainfall that contains PFAS, or dry deposition is small particulates that land on the ground when it's not raining. So the PFAS are coming across the river from the facility in Merrimack, landing on the ground. And as it rains and water leaches through the soil into the underlying aquifers, you have migration of the PFAS deeper into the ground where it can be reach the aquifers, whether it be fractured bedrock or overburdened aquifers, and they can be drawn into water supply wells. I do want to point out briefly that Saint-Gobain is currently required to install air pollution control equipment at their facility for PFAS, and that is due by July 30th, 2021. If anyone has any questions about that treatment equipment, we have Kathy Beam, who will be one of the panelists at the end of the presentation, and she could answer any questions on the air side of things. So there are three primary sources for PFAS water quality data in the town of Litchfield. The first one is Saint-Gobain. They are responsible for evaluating the extent of ambient groundwater quality violations inside the consent decree area due to discharges from its Merrimack facility. So those are primarily air emissions relating to the town of Litchfield. So to the end of their responsibility for investigating the PFAS violations, they submitted a work plan in September of 2019 that coincided with a lowering from 70 parts per trillion down to 12. And that work plan outlined a means of sampling wells, residential water supply wells, and evaluating the extent of PFAS. And that's a risk-based plan. So it focuses on areas where you would expect there to be a greater risk of groundwater contamination and working outward successively. And as part of that successive progression of the study, Saint-Gobain's consultants have submitted 8 addenda to the work plan, identifying additional sets of properties as new data comes in and it forms the direction for the investigation to take. A 9th addenda is expected by the end of May, so we expect one coming shortly. Saint-Gobain's consultants submit bi-weekly updates and bi-monthly reports. They go to DES and they are uploaded and publicly available for viewing on DES's one-stop website. The second source of PFAS sampling data are data submitted from residents who self-sample their own well, have it analyzed by a lab, and submit those results to DES. And I just want to say it's really important if you choose to sample your well on your own, and particularly if your results are above standard, that you submit those to DES so that, one, we can investigate those results and, provide those results to Saint-Gobain and get you on the list for alternate water, which I'll talk about later on in my talk. And finally, the third source of data is from public water supplies that have to do PFAS sampling as part of DES regulations. So here is a map on the right-hand side of the slide showing the results of PFOA analyses collected on numerous water samples throughout the town of Litchfield. And the reason I'm showing PFOA, even though we regulate for PFAS, PFOA is the compound that most frequently exceeds the standards, ambient groundwater quality standards, and is most frequently associated with the air emissions from the Saint-Gobain facility. So for the remainder of my talk, I'm going to be showing figures and diagrams referring to the PFOA. And throughout my talk, I use a consistent color scheme, which you can see to the left of the map. And I just want to call out, so the standard for PFOA is 12 parts per trillion. So anything that's less than half of that standard is shown as a green circle on the map. Anything that's between 6 and 9 parts per trillion is shown as a yellow circle. 9 to 12 is orange. And anything that's over the standard is shown as a red circle. So anything that's over 12 is red. Anything that's over our previous standard of 70 parts per trillion is shown as purple. So going back to the map, you can see that virtually all of the purple samples, or purple groundwater samples in Litchfield, are within the red pre-GMZ boundary that Mike talked about. And those are the areas where Saint-Gobain extended public water to remedy all of these wells that were over the standard or proximal to wells that were over the standard. But once the standard was lowered from 70 down to 12 parts per trillion, the investigation expanded outside the pre-GMZ And there are a number of wells in Litchfield that are over the standard of 12, shown in red. And those are wells that are ultimately going to need to be addressed by Saint-Gobain. And I'll talk about that a little more when I get to alternate water. But overall, 522 wells throughout the town have been sampled. And of those 522 wells that have been sampled, approximately 365 exceed the ambient groundwater quality standard for one or more PFAS. So now drilling down into the Saint-Gobain sampling program, the map on the right is an overall map from one of the Saint-Gobain's consultants, environmental consultants, Golder Associates, who's doing the sampling work. They submit these to DES. And this figure shows the entirety of the consent decree area, which involves portions of several towns. So then I blew up the portion of the consent decree area for the town of Litchfield, and that's in the center of the slide. And I just want to walk you through some of the many colors. It's a very complex and busy map, but it's important to note some of the colors. So within the pre-GMZ, the light purple pink color indicates that those properties within that zone have had alternate water made available to them by Saint-Gobain under the terms of the 2018 consent decree. And then moving outside that pre-GMZ, call it several colors. So the green color indicates properties that have been confirmed to be supplied by public water. So there are a number of properties within the southern half of Litchfield that are already connected to public water. And the properties that are colored light blue are thought to be connected to public water. They're proximal to a water line, but it has not yet been confirmed by Saint-Gobain's consultants. Next, I want to draw your attention to the brown areas. The brown areas are parcels that have either been sampled by Saint-Gobain or DES or have been invited to be sampled. Not everyone has chosen to accept the invitation to be sampled, but the brown colors show properties that have been brought into the sampling program through either the original work plan or the 8 subsequent addenda. And next I want to point out the bright pink colors. Those are properties that have been tested and are above the standard for PFOA or one or more of the regulated PFAS, and those properties are currently receiving bottled water from Saint-Gobain. And finally, the white or non-colored lots are parcels that have not yet been brought into the sampling program and may have a water supply well. So one question I frequently get from residents is, why was my property selected for sampling? And in the case of Litchfield, there are 2 primary criteria for selection, and the first being a proximity to a known detection above the ambient groundwater quality standard. So if your neighbor's well tests above standard, often Saint-Gobain incorporates your adjoining property into the next addenda. And going forward, Saint-Gobain will be using a 500-foot buffer around water supply wells that test above standard to identify any lot that clips that 500-foot buffer. They'll be invited to be sampled in subsequent rounds. So I'm expecting that in addenda 9 that's coming at the end of the month. The second category of selections are based on what I call quasi-random, where Saint-Gobain's consultants identify somewhat at random properties that are distant from any known PFAS samples. So in the example on this map, these blue hash marks are somewhat distant from any other PFAS samples. So to try and identify if there's PFAS in areas that have not yet been sampled, just to get a general idea of groundwater quality. And also just want to point out, there's a different color scheme on this map. Samples that are over the standard are colored yellow, and samples that are less than the 12 parts per trillion or less than or equal to 12 parts per trillion are colored green. So a little bit of a different color ramp, since this is an excerpt from Saint-Gobain's consultant's figure. So under state rules, responsible party must provide alternate water in cases where wells become contaminated as a result of a release from their facility. So as part of that 2019 water supply sampling work plan, it also included provisions for alternate water. So in the short run, bottled water is the option until such time as a permanent solution, such as extension of public water or installation of point of entry treatment systems can be accomplished. So if a well tests above standard as part of this Saint-Gobain sampling program, Saint-Gobain will issue a letter, like I have an example on the right-hand side on Saint-Gobain letterhead, along with a package that includes the lab results from the laboratory sample. It also includes a cover letter from Golder Associates who collected the sample and had it analyzed, as well as a summary table. And I'll talk a little bit about that summary table later on. But if the water sample is above standard, the homeowner will receive an eligibility to receive bottled water letter on Saint-Gobain letterhead. And on that, I've highlighted in yellow, is a phone number to call for Monadnock Spring Water to arrange bottled water delivery. So this slide was provided by Golder Associates. DES asked for just clarification on how this bottled water program is working and the steps to go through to obtain bottled water. So when a well tests above standard, Golder Associates provides that package that I described to the homeowner, as well as copies of that letter to Monadnock Springs, so they can expect a call from the resident to set up the bottled water delivery. Next, the owner contacts Monadnock Springs, coordinates the delivery, sets up routine delivery dates and amounts of water. And finally, the property owner is asked to monitor their inventory of water and notify Monadnock Springs 2 to 3 weeks before additional water is needed. And finally, it's important to note that the property owner should make sure that all occupants of the residence or property be aware that the bottled water is being made available and that it should be used for cooking and drinking. And this is particularly true in the case where there are tenants who may not be receiving the correspondence. So it's important to make everyone aware. So one thing we find as we look at the map pattern of PFAS, so again, this is PFOA with the same color scale that I talked about earlier, is that we have a very complex distribution. In many cases, we have neighboring wells that are adjacent to each other, or very close to each other, and one will be over standard and one will be above standard. And I get a lot of questions as to why that is. And there are several factors that combine to result in this complex pattern that we see in groundwater with respect to PFOA and PFAS. And the first one starts off with air deposition. So in the upper left of this image, the yellow to purple color is a shaded map showing modeled aerial deposition of PFOA across the area, with the yellow representing higher amounts of PFOA deposition and the purple indicating lower amounts of PFOA deposition. And in general, the amount of PFOA deposition decreases with distance from the facility, from the Saint-Gobain facility, although local variations in topography and wind patterns can have some influence on the actual map pattern that we see. Another major factor in the distribution of PFAS in groundwater is the superficial geology, or the types of soils or glacial materials that are present above the bedrock surface. So in the case of New Hampshire, a lot of what you see on the ground surface is very closely related to the last glaciation, when glacial ice moved across the area and then retreated as the climate warmed at that time, and left behind various deposits. And these types of deposits are important because as rainwater with PFAS infiltrate through those soils, the PFAS have different tendencies to sorb or stick to those superficial deposits, and that can change the concentration of the water as it moves through a soil column or sediment column. So the distribution of those different glacial sediments, whether it be till or sand and gravel, or in the case of Litchfield, where there are lake beds or fluvial deposits, which are fine silty sands and in some cases clay, can really influence changes in groundwater chemistry as it moves through that soil. Finally, bedrock geology is also a major factor, and I'll talk more about that in detail on my next slide. And time-related factors, such as changes in the chemicals that have been released from Saint-Gobain over time, can influence what we see in the subsurface, as well as precursor transformations or bigger molecules that break down into the 4 PFAS that we regulate. And finally, seasonal variation, so changes in the amount of rainfall, whether it's drought or wet weather, and temperature and various other effects can influence the overall map pattern that we see. So getting back to the question of why neighboring wells can have very different concentrations of PFOA, to try and address that, I've developed a hypothetic cross-section or profile view, essentially a slice through the earth. So we're looking at the vertically down in from a well into the ground. And we're looking at an example of 3 wells. The one on the right is what we call a shallow overburden well. Sometimes they're referred to as driven wells or dug wells. Also talking about bedrock wells. So they're a well that's drilled through the soil, which I've indicated as brown, and into rock. And I've got 2 examples of those on this diagram. So I've represented the PFOA concentrations using the same color ramp again as the map. So anything that's red is over our ambient groundwater quality standard of 12. So these red arrows going into the soil represent aerial deposition onto the soil and infiltration of shallow water that's over the standard. And in the case of the shallow overburden well, which is on the right-hand side, the water is making its way in, and it has a relatively short flow path. So there's not a lot of time for the PFAS to sorb or stick to the soil, like I mentioned earlier. So it gets into the shallow well screen and is pumped out of the well, and it's above the standard in this example. Now, there could be a bedrock well nearby or next to this overburden well, and when a bedrock well is drilled, casing is extended, so steel casing is extended down through the soil into rock, so it prevents any water from the soil infiltrating into the well, and it prevents the soil from collapsing into the well too. And then a driller drills down through the rock below the casing, leaving an open rock hole until they hit a series of water-bearing fractures or cracks, such as the one shown on the left-hand side of this photograph. This is a photo taken with a downhole well video camera, and we're actually about 108 feet down inside a well looking at water coming through these water-bearing fractures or cracks. So that's what you might see if you were to pull your cap off and go down the well with a camera. So in the case of this middle example, water going through a thick soil column has sorbed PFAS as it moves through that thick soil column, so that by the time it enters the ground, it's slightly below the standard, somewhere between 9 and 12 parts per trillion in this example. And that is the first fracture that was encountered by the well. And then there's a deeper fracture that has a very low concentration, less than 50% of the ambient groundwater quality standard, 0 to 6 parts per trillion in this case. And the resulting mixture of the water from those 2 fracture zones is 6 to 9 parts per trillion. So it's less than the first fracture, but greater than the deeper fracture. And then moving over to another example of a bedrock well. This well is sited in a location where there's very thin soil cover. So again, there's limited opportunity for the PFAS to sorb to the soil. And this well encountered a shallow fracture, shallow fracture, and the groundwater that has worked its way through the soil into those fractures is above 12 parts per trillion. So, in this example, I have 2 wells that are over standard and 1 that's below standard. I'll just talk briefly about NHDES's notification program. There is a state law that requires DES to notify property owners within 500 feet of a well that has an AGQS violation. Recently, DES sent out a number of these letters to satisfy that statutory requirement. And I have an example, first page of an example letter on the right-hand side. And these letters include contact information and directions on how to proceed if you would like to have your well sampled. So in the case of St. Gobain, I provide an 800 number that you can call to inquire where you fit in their sampling program, or there's also an email address for Golder Associates that you can send an email to. And I just want to point out, it is taking them 3 to 5 days to get back to people. It's a bit of a process to go through, but be patient, and they should return your call within several days. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about lab reports, and in this example of this slide, the summary table that Saint-Gobain's consultant Golder submits to each homeowner after they test their well. So this is a summary table of the 20+ page lab report. So they try and put all the information you need on one page. If you don't have experience looking at this, it's a little bit confusing. So I'm going to walk you through an example here. The 4 compounds that DES regulates, PFOA, PFNA, PFHXS, and PFOS, I've highlighted in yellow. So I tend to use the analyte acronym because it's a little shorter and easier to remember. So I find those, and then I scroll across, look at the units. So this is nanograms per liter, which is equivalent to parts per trillion. We use those interchangeably for residential water supply samples. And then the next column I'll draw your attention to, I've circled in blue, is the ambient groundwater quality standards. That's the state regulation. So in the case of PFOA, the standard is 12. And then the column that you really need to pay attention to is the result column. So that's what was detected in the water sample from your well, or in this example. So in this case, the PFOA result was 66 nanograms per liter, parts per trillion, which is greater than 12. So in this case, we have a violation of the standard for PFOA. I do want to show another convention, which is confusing, and that is some of these results, you'll notice a number followed by a U, and the U stands for the compound was not detected by the laboratory. And there's something called a method detection limit, or minimum detectable value, that a lab can measure. So a lab can't measure down to 0, they just technically cannot do that. So they often report the minimum amount they can measure. So in the case of a compound that's undetected, they just have this convention of putting the minimum detectable level and a U. So in the case of PFNA, in this example, PFNA was not detected above that minimum level of 0.47. Next, I'll talk about just very briefly an example lab report. So if you happen to get your well tested and send it to a private lab, you might get a report that resembles this. It's not tabulated in many cases. And one thing that's missing is the ambient groundwater quality standards. You have to look those up, go on the DES website, or remember them from this talk. But they do have the common result column here. So in this example, PFOA is at 14.4, which is just slightly over the standard of 12. And they use a different convention than the U that I mentioned on the previous slide. They have a non-detect, or ND, for compounds that were not detected above that minimum level. So it's a little less confusing, but you just have to remember what ND stands for. And finally, I want to draw your attention to the NHDES PFAS investigation webpage. There's a lot of information here that could be helpful to you. Across the top, there's a menu bar, includes PFAS information in drinking water. So that includes private well testing information on PFAS treatment technology. We have a place to sign up if you're interested in having DES sample your well, although DES is currently not sampling in areas where Saint-Gobain is responsible for conducting the investigation, as in Litchfield. And there's also an interactive map and data. And I'll just point out that the color scheme on this map is different from what I've shown, so just be aware of that. But you can zoom in and look at your neighborhood and see what the results are of any surrounding wells that have been tested and uploaded into EMD, or our GIS database. So there may be more PFAS data out there. This map only shows the ones that have been uploaded to DES. Finally, we have a frequently asked questions on PFAS. And there's a running blog just below the screen here. If you were actually on the website, you could scroll down, and there's a topical blog of newsworthy developments in PFAS in general, and Saint-Gobain in particular, dating back to about 2016. And you can scroll through those and get a little bit of a history on the site. And if you want to subscribe for those blog post alerts, so if there's a new blog post posted, you can scroll down and find the subscribe and sign up to get an email. So that concludes everything I'm going to talk about tonight. We'll move on to questions, and I'm going to turn it over to Aaron to walk you through how the questions are going to work.
Thanks, Jeff. So I think the DES team is just going to take a quick little break, and feel free if you'd like to take a moment just to take care of yourself. What I'm going to do is I'm turning on the Ask Question function in the GoToWebinar, and when I do this, let me see if I've got the oh, there we go. So I do have, I'll go through the ground rules, but I just want to, I'm going to skip ahead real quick and show you what it looks like. So if you cannot see what I call the dashboard, and that's the picture that you're seeing on the screen in the corner, you will probably see a little orange arrow. If you click that arrow, it should expand the dashboard, and you'll see now under your audio functions, the gray box labeled question. And so that's where you can enter questions for the panel. But what we'd like you to do is, instead of asking your question in there, if you can actually just put your name and the town of residence in there, that's what we'll use to find you, and we'll unmute you so that you can ask the panel your question. So really that questions box, that gray question box, is really just to identify to us that you would like to ask a question, because we really want to keep this as close to a town meeting as possible. Sorry. So we want to keep this close to a real live town meeting as possible. We'll be monitoring those, and once we identify you, I'll be actually having a screen up after I go through this that shows the list of people's names we have and where you are in the queue. And then we'll be able to call on you that way. So sorry, there's a little family distraction here. Let me go right to the next screen. So when you are invited to speak, I will let you know that you've been unmuted. If your microphone next to your name is not green, you may have to unmute yourself. And if you just put your mouse over it, it'll let you know that you've been unmuted by the organizer, that's me, and that you can unmute yourself and speak. So when you do, we are asking that attendees be limited to about 3 minutes to ask your questions to accommodate those in the queue. That's just we would just like you to focus and get to the question. We know everybody had this, PFAS affects everybody in different ways, and we're very sensitive to that, but there's not a lot of attendees tonight, so I think we'll be able to move forward. If you have more questions, you can always re-enter your name back into the queue. But while your question is being answered by the panel, we will keep you unmuted. So if you have a follow-up question with the panel at that moment, that is fine for you to keep engaging with them. And then just let us know that you're all set, and I will go ahead and mute you again and then get ready to unmute the next person. So I already showed this. I'll just show this one more time. I'll leave this up. I see some questions starting to come in, and so I will leave this up for another moment or two. Like I said, if you can't see that menu, there's that little orange arrow or little orange block with the white arrow. Just click on that, and that will expand this menu for you, and then you'll be able to ask your question. And I will leave this up. I'm going to turn my camera off, and I'm going to start pulling up names in the queue. And then when I start to hear the panel and see the panel come back, I'll switch it over to the queue list so that you know where you're at.
All right, Erin, this is Amy. If you look at your dashboard, do you see a handouts tab in there?
I do not, but one of the attendees that I did speak with said that they saw that handout tab.
Okay, perfect.
So maybe someone like Mary Butow or Karen Craver can let us know in the chat, or they can chat to me as an organizer, or if you can send in a question that you can see the handouts, Mary or Karen, that would be great.
All right. So while we're waiting, if you cannot see the handouts, don't worry. In a day after this presentation, you're going to receive a follow-up email, And in that email, there's going to be a link to a Dropbox. So you'll have access to the handouts that are attached to this platform tonight, as well as some additional items that came up in our last meeting's question and answer session. So some additional information. And give me a day or two, but the video link will also be posted at that same link as well. So you'll have access to that, and the presentation slides will be in there. So that email will go out to everybody in attendance. So you'll have that link. Mary says that she can see the handouts, so that is good.
Okay. So what I'm going to do, Amy, I will share my screen, or I'll share this Word document. I've got the names in there. So if you want to make me a presenter.
Should be good to go.
Okay. All right. Can you see the Word document?
I can, yes.
Okay. All right. So give me 1 second. I'm doing some fancy screen work here.
All right, and Erin, if you can help me, because I cannot see who's on camera and who's not. I want to apologize again. I know myself, I am not on camera. I believe Mike Wimsat will not be on camera, and Brandon Kernan is also having camera issues tonight. So I believe they're in the same position as me, where they cannot see the other presenters either.
Mm-hmm.
So we might just need some assistance.
Yep, so we have Jonathan Ali, Dr. Ali, Jeff Martz, Amy Doherty, and Kathy Beam are all on camera. And then, as Amy said, in the background, we have Mike Wimsat, Amy, and Brandon. And so I think everybody is here, and we can get started. Sorry, let me close this. All right. So the first person is Rich Lascelles, and Rich, I am going to go through and unmute you. I think. Okay, Rich, you are unmuted.
Much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I am currently a selectman in Litchfield as well as a state representative. And my question has to do with Saint-Gobain's response to what's been happening. And it's my understanding that they are, as we speak, continuing to pollute. My first question is that true?
So this is Kathy Beam from the Air Division. I think what you're asking is, are they still having air emissions coming out uncontrolled? And the answer to that question is yes. They were required under their permit to install a regenerative thermal oxidizer as of February of this year, and they failed to do that. We have entered into a consent decree with them, and their deadline now is July 30th. We have other additional requirements associated with the consent decree as a result of that. I can go through the list of what the consent decree talks about if you're interested.
No, that's all right. It's just, it's hard for me to understand how they have caused so much damage, but yet they are continuing to pollute. That's just hard for me to understand.
Well, perhaps I can explain it a little bit. The facility has been there since I believe the 1980s when it was ChemFab, and then 2000s when it was Saint-Gobain. And in 2004 timeframe, they did some stack testing for air emissions and found that their PFOA emissions were high enough to require reformulation or controls. We had a consent decree at that time. They reformulated and reduced their PFOA emissions by something like 96%, and it continued to go down after that. That was as a result of a consent decree because of our air inhalation standards that we have in the state. When the discovery of the water contamination issue occurred in 2016, there was no legislation or regulation related to the impact that air emissions have on water until, forgive me, I think it's Senate Bill 309. But anyway, it was a law that was passed in 2018 that required facilities, if the department determines they're causing or contributing to a groundwater problem as a result of air emissions, they have to put on control equipment. So that law became effective in late 2018. We issued a letter to them telling them that they were subject to that law. And in that law, it gives 6 months for the company to apply for an air permit and to determine what that control technology will be. They submitted that application in February of 2019. We issued a permit to them in February of 2020, and that gave them 1 year from that deadline, or from the issuance of that permit, to install that control equipment. And as I said, they failed to meet that deadline in February, to which we entered into a consent decree, and it's required to be installed by this July. So it pretty much follows along with the regulatory schedule up until the point where they missed the deadline in February, but we're hopeful that that will be resolved this July.
What level of assurance do you have that they'll meet the July deadline?
So part of the permit itself is a monthly monitoring report on the status of the installation of the equipment. We have been getting those reports ever since February of 2020. And they're all online on our one-stop page. And they have recently submitted an update last week in which they provided documentation and pictures and whatnot of the equipment that's already been put on in place over at the facility. They haven't completed the complete installation yet, but the piping and all of that has been installed, and they're working toward that.
My last question is, everyone is concerned about what happens to a person or a baby or whatever who has long-term exposure to PFAS. And I understand that at the present time, it's undetermined what the long-term exposure is. Can you give us an update on where they are with respect to determining that impact?
Sure, I can answer that question. So there's a couple different ways that this is being addressed right now at this time. The first is that there's actually, right now, they started this last spring, there's a panel from the National Academies of Science that's comprised of toxicologists, epidemiologists, physicians, and other individuals that specialize in chemical exposures. And they're developing guidance and recommendations for physicians to understand and interpret what PFAS exposure means, and if people get their blood tested, how physicians might be able to interpret that. And also how to help people understand what they might be at increased risk for and what they can do to potentially reduce those risks. That is probably a year to 2 years out before that panel will be able to finish their results. But in the meantime, as I mentioned before, there's a branch of the CDC, or the National Institute of Health, that is currently working on a nationwide study to try to address those specific questions. So trying to understand if people were exposed through their drinking water or other sources in their environment, what were those people at increased risk for in the United States? And what's been hard is previous studies that have been done don't control for certain factors that make it hard to say yes or no to certain outcomes. The study, they're trying to control for that. And actually, the Peace Tradeport area and the community in Portsmouth is part of that. So New Hampshire is being represented in that study. So hopefully when they have those results, we'll be able to translate that back. But The other thing is for individuals, if they do have concerns, we really do encourage them to speak with their physicians for 2 reasons. One, your physician knows your medical history and can help make sure that, you know, there's an effect with PFAS that they're especially concerned about. They can identify that and work with you as an individual. And if they need more information about what that is, we're happy to give them that information. We have also heard from the communities that a lot of physicians are not familiar with PFAS because chemical exposures is not a part of standard med school training. When someone goes to school to be a nurse or a physician or a family practicing doctor, they do not receive training in exposure to environmental chemicals. That's considered a specialty. But we do have staff in our own agency at DES, we have staff at DHHS, and we also have a partnership with the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry to try to provide education or answer questions and give those resources. Patients don't need to run down all those resources because they have enough to worry about. Just if they want to tell their physician, contact us at the state agency. My number is back there. It'll be at the end of this presentation. I'm happy to connect people with that. But unfortunately, there is still a lot that we don't know. So there is some uncertainty that we work with, but there are ways that we can reduce risk for the things associated with PFAS and a lot of other health concerns. And again, we're happy to share that information. Did I answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rich. So Noreen LaFleur, Noreen, you are unmuted. Noreen, you should be unmuted and all set. Try this again. Noreen, it shows that you are connected to audio. Let me see if there's another. Can you guys hear me? Can the panel hear me? Okay.
We can hear
Yes,
you.
I can hear you.
Okay. Noreen, if you want to just send a message to me in the questions, or you can type in your question if you want to send another message. It looks like there may be some issues with your audio. It shows that you're self-muted, so if you maybe try to unmute yourself again. Okay. We'll see if she can send in a question. Let me see. So Noreen, I'll look for your question to come into the question box. Otherwise, we're going to move on to Laura Hyde. Laura, you are unmuted. Is that, I don't know. Mary Butow, can you unmute yourself so we can just test and see if we're having issues with the audience? And I just
Can you hear me?
is that Laura? Yeah, I can hear you, Laura.
Yes, this is Laura. Sorry, I had to click an allow microphone button, so my apologies.
Gotcha.
And thank you for taking my question. I was curious if you have any insight on how regularly we should be getting our water wells tested. Just for context, we've had our well tested a few times since 2016, and we have ranged from 9.8 nanograms per liter up down to 2.5. And I just wasn't sure if there's any kind of background on how much these levels can vary over time.
Thanks for the question. So again, it's Jeff Martz, hydrogeologist. So that's something we've been looking at. We don't have a large data set from the area. There's a handful of wells scattered throughout the consent decree area that have been sampled like yours more than once. We tend to see more variation in what I refer to as a overburden well or dug well. So those are wells that are screened in the soil. They tend to have much greater variability. over time compared to, say, a bedrock well. The bedrock wells generally tend to be more stable, but we also can see some variation in those as well. So it's really hard to predict an individual well. Normally, as a contaminated site is managed and we get into a groundwater management zone and there's a permit that governs how that's managed, there's usually a regular schedule for sampling wells that could be as frequently as 3 times a year to once a year, depending on how stable we see data. But given that we're still in the investigation phase to determine the extent of contamination, we haven't reached a point where all wells or a number of wells are being regularly sampled. So beyond that, I don't have a great answer other than you may consider sampling in different seasons. So maybe in the spring and the fall when you have a wet and a dry period.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then I guess just building a little bit on Rich's question about long-term effects. Again, this is specific to my context where we so far have always tested below the limit, but still have detectable levels. I'm just curious about the confidence that you have in in the level of risk in long-term exposures to these lower levels of contamination.
Sure, I can take that question. Thank you for that. So one of the things that we think about with the PFAS chemicals when we were setting the standards is trying to predict if you're exposed at a certain level, how much may be in your blood. And it's sort of unique for risk assessment of chemicals and setting of standards. That's sort of an additional step that we do that's a little bit more protective than sometimes what we've seen with historical chemicals that have less information about them. But one of the things that we do recognize is in basically our worst case scenario, which is what we base the standard off of. So someone that is drinking this water exclusively for 30 or more years and there is no fluctuation, it's staying at that high number the entire time. It's not dipping below that. There's no variability to it. And we're also assuming that they are drinking the most water and that they only get their water from that one source. In that situation, we predict that people would be getting a similar amount of PFOA or these other PFAS chemicals as what they may have gotten historically before these chemicals were phased out, or what's even just found in the background population of the United States. So that's usually what we compare against. So if we understand the general risk within the US, it's very comparable to that, although year by year, it'll actually go down, and generation by generation, it'll go down if people meet the standards that we're looking at. So there is always this question of what if there's new studies that show that there are lower effects, or there's lower doses, there's lower exposures that cause more effects. That's something that our agency is keeping an eye on, and actually as part of developing these standards, we provide an annual update to our commissioner to understand if there is a need to lower these based on newer science. Myself and my team in the environmental health program do keep track of that, and we also try to coordinate with other states and other agencies that are doing research on this, so we're staying on top of it. There's always new information coming out about these chemicals, so we are keeping tabs on that just to see if there's a reason that we would need to recommend a different standard than what we've taken at this time. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. So basically, we still don't know for sure, but it's being researched.
Right, it's being researched, but at this level, it's going to be a risk reduction and it's a huge exposure reduction for people. But just to be clear from an environmental health standpoint, also with your well, make sure if you're testing for PFAS to see if there's any fluctuation, check for other things too, because we do have natural contaminants in New Hampshire that might compound the risk. So we have things like arsenic, uranium, radon, a lot of these other contaminants that could, even if you're testing for PFAS and treating that, they could be increasing your risk for adverse health effects. So just like to think holistically about that.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you. And I have one final tiny question, which is you were talking about using that we should avoid using contaminated water for cooking. What about contaminated water for washing produce?
So for washing produce, you may get a small residual amount that could be on food items, but generally, like if you're just washing it, that's not as much of a concern as if you're cooking, where you could either be actually like reducing the amount of water as it cooks off, but it leaves the chemical behind. But if you're washing produce, that's not as much a concern. Things like protein is what PFAS tends to stick to in food items. So things like vegetables, produce like that, we're not terribly worried. If you're thinking about like root vegetables, there's already soil on there that could have heavy metals. So we always just recommend really wash those pretty well and peel them. So at this point though, it's not considered a huge risk, but again, if you're not comfortable with that, then you may want to seek an alternative source of waters for those items, depending on how you're cooking or preparing them.
Great, thank you so much. Those are all my questions.
No problem. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. So I will ask Noreen's questions. Noreen, I'm going to unmute you just in case you figured out how to unmute yourself, but let me see. So you are unmuted, but Noreen's first question is, are there any clothing, let me see. Oh, clotting. Are there any clotting health issues associated with this exposure? And I hope that's correct.
So with PFAS exposure, specifically PFOA, there's not really been any evidence for clotting disorders associated with it. The strongest evidence is for things like increased cholesterol, changes in liver enzyme levels, some alteration in immune function, and probably the closest thing is maybe an increased risk of hypertension or pregnancy-induced hypertension in certain women. But there isn't really much evidence for any kind of clotting disorders or anything like strokes or other basically issues of clotting factors like that.
Okay. Thanks, Jonathan. And Noreen's other question is, when we made the decision to keep our well for watering grass, there was a higher, and she says a higher normal, I'm assuming that's a higher standard. Now it's below the allowed level. Any recourses at this time to close the well? So just reading the question, and Noreen, feel free to clarify it. It looks like they kept their well, and I just can't tell from your question if you're saying that your well is maybe between the standard now, but below the higher level, and do you need to close your well? So I guess just kind of talk about the private well interconnect or connecting to a public water system scenario that happened in Litchfield, and people that may exist in that kind of new above the standard area with their private well. And that's probably Jeff Martz.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, so in the case of where water lines were extended under the consent decree, Saint-Gobain had agreed to, pay for the abandonment. Hello?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Noreen, when we made the decision, we're using the city water for drinking, but we kept the well for washing the car, watering the lawn, but now that's below accepted normal levels. And I'm worried about my house value. If I keep that, is there any recourse as far as Saint-Gobain helping people out that made the decision, earlier with closing the well?
Yeah, thanks, Noreen. So under the terms of the consent decree, Saint-Gobain, had the obligation to abandon the well if you so chose, or in the case of where you elected to keep it, they replumbed it so it couldn't be used for drinking water in the house. But once they've completed the work under the consent decree, it's my understanding that there's no requirement for them to go back now and abandon your well. But perhaps Mike could weigh in. It's also, I believe that, you could certainly reach out to Saint-Gobain on your own. It's just that the state can't necessarily compel them to abandon your well. And I don't know, Mike, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I think you caught it pretty well, Jeff. But I think that probably be a good idea for you to just reach out to us on this, and we can explore this a little further. I mean, essentially what was represented, I think at the time, was that there was a window where you could make this decision. But if you made the decision to retain it, then a decision later to decommission it would be at your own expense. But there's a lot of moving parts here and a lot of different scenarios. So I would recommend that you give me a call so that we can talk about this offline and see if there's any opportunities for you.
Thank you for taking the time.
Aaron, before you move on, I
Yeah.
just want to let everyone know that in those handouts, there is a resource and contact information PDF in there. And in that contact information is everybody's emails and phone numbers that are on the panel tonight. So that's where our contact information is. And I can put it up at the end after all the questions have been asked as well, so people can get a look at it.
What are the
Okay.
options?
Excellent. So the next person we have is Barbara Anderson. Barbara, you are unmuted.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
The first question that I had was pretty much covered by Laura, but I just wanted to know, can the PFOA results at your well improve a lot or get a lot worse? Have you found that in other places? If there can be much change?
Yeah, thanks. So there are some instances. I've got one well in another town that is a very shallow overburden well that has gone from non-detect to over standard. Several months to a year apart. I forget the exact time frame. We tend to not see that much variation, except when we're looking at wells on the St. Gobain site itself, where the concentrations are very high. There we see very big fluctuations. But when we're regulating a standard of 12 parts per trillion, there can be some variation around there. And to try and answer this question better, we've asked St. Gobain to resample wells, or to begin to resample. The priority remains to be on sampling wells that have not yet been sampled for the first time. But St. Gobain is currently resampling wells that tested between 10 and 12 parts per trillion to see if we're seeing variation above the standard in that case. So we do have some data. Some wells vary, some don't vary at all over the years. And we are trying to obtain more data to further evaluate that.
Okay. And my well tested at 13, so that's why I wondered if it can get lower and be healthier or get worse. But related to that, I'm wondering what the long-term solutions are for someone whose well just rates a 13 PPT. I thought you had mentioned, in addition to extending town water, public water, some kind of filtration system, or what are the other alternatives?
So the other alternative is what we call a whole house point of entry treatment system. And most commonly today, the technology is granular activated carbon. So, if the route was to use this type of treatment instead of extending public water, your water from your well would go through a pressure tank and then go through a series of carbon vessels or tanks that are filled with carbon. And the PFAS have a tendency to stick to that carbon. And St. Gobain would be responsible for installing those, maintaining them, testing to make sure that they're working correctly. And if over time the concentration in the well drops down below standard, there would be a way to eventually remove the treatment system if it's no longer needed.
Now, on my street, there have been people who've tested just over, I think the highest was in the 30s. Is public water still a possibility? We're outside the main zone.
So right now we don't have a firm plan from St. Gobain as to how they're proposing to remedy all of these wells. And I would say at this time that extension of public water and point of entry treatment systems are both options that are on the table.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Barbara. And next we have Linda Lantagni. Linda, I apologize if I messed up your last name, but you are unmuted.
Yeah, testing.
Okay, yep, we can hear you.
Yeah, I just had a quick question about the cost. Now, we've been on public water because of this for the last couple of years, and that the price increases have been going up, yearly. Understanding that, replacing my well pump would happen every 5 to 10 years religiously, regardless of what I did. Is there anything that St. Gobain is going to do to offset these costs to us? number one, we didn't cause this problem, Saint-Gobain did. And number two, we really liked our well water. So at this point in time, what is Saint-Gobain going to do for us? Because we didn't ask for this, and we would really like some sort of remedy.
Sure. So thanks for the question. This is Mike Wimsat. So yeah, we understand that for people who have lived for many years on a private well, going to a public water system with a monthly bill can be a bit of a shock to the system. And we're sensitive to that. We understand that. We've certainly talked with a lot of people about that issue. So under the state law and under the laws that govern this agreement with Saint-Gobain, they, as a responsible party for the contamination, had a responsibility to provide safe alternate water to people whose wells that they impacted. And in general, we have seen and viewed extension of a regulated public water system as the best long-term solution to that. And the way that's been implemented, the expectation is that the responsible party will construct an extension of the public water system to the extent one is needed, make the actual pay for all the costs of connecting that water system to the home, doing the in-home connections. But after that, we have not required that parties who do that, and this goes well before Saint-Gobain's time in this project, to pay monthly water bills. And that is a source of frustration for people. You know, I'm not sure, you know, there's nothing I could say to make you feel better about a monthly water bill that you have. I will tell you that there are a lot of benefits to being on a public water system. Not only that, you know, number one, you've got clean water now that isn't, you know, contaminated with PFAS, but also that water system, which in your case is provided by Pennachuck East Utilities. It's a well-run water system. They invest in their systems. They are responsible for their treatment. They not only make sure that it doesn't have any PFAS in it, but they have a responsibility to make sure that that water meets all applicable standards for public water systems, and that may include other contaminants. One of the advantages I will tell you is that in New Hampshire, we have a lot of naturally occurring contaminants, things like arsenic and manganese and radon that are often present in naturally occurring groundwater in the state at concentrations that are above the recommended standards.
It's really occurring in my groundwater already, which I had my well tested all the time. So.
Thank you for your answer.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Are you all set, Mr. Lentagny?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. The next question we have is from April. It's an email, so I will just read the question. April Weber asks, regarding Saint-Gobain's failure to meet the required February 2020 date, I see that there is a civil penalty that Saint-Gobain must pay. Could you please provide that cost?
Sure. So as part of the consent decree that the state and Saint-Gobain entered into, they're required to pay a fine of $100,000 and $200,000. And if they do everything that's part of the agreement, then it's reduced to the $100,000 amount.
Okay, and we have another question, and I am going to unmute Rich Lascelles, but it looks like he's offline. He's from the town. So the other question I have that was an email from Darlene asks, is there an investigation regarding a cancer cluster around Saint-Gobain? We have quite a few local people diagnosed with different types of cancer, myself included, and I have a very rare form of kidney cancer.
So I can answer that partially. So cancer investigations are a part of the work that the New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services conducts. They did do a cancer report a few years back for the area. One of the problems with this and this kind of approach of trying to ask them to do this sort of cancer investigation is the state does not collect data in a way to conclusively say cancers are not associated with a certain source like a facility in a region. Our state does have a cancer registry that tracks the incidence of certain cancers, but it doesn't track enough information for us to actually conduct that kind of investigation. So when someone is diagnosed with a certain form of cancer, their information is sent to this registry on what kind of cancer they have, where they live, but it doesn't capture things like how long did they live in the area, or how long were they using water, or other things that we would need to draw those kinds of associations. So while the state can basically issue a cancer report, it will not answer that question of, is it associated with this exposure? So unfortunately, that's just not a resource that we have. If you do have more questions about that, you can follow up with me and I can put you in contact with the team at the Department of Health and Human Services and at Dartmouth College that does this work for the state. So PFOA has been associated with certain forms of renal cancer in some patients for certain populations, but there's a lot of other things we have to bear in mind with that. If either you or your practitioner or your medical team would like some more information about that, I'm happy to share that. But to ultimately answer your question at this time, we just don't have the solid ability to be able to do that kind of investigation to look and see, is there an increased incidence of any kind of cancer related to a certain source or in a geographic area. Does that answer your question?
She's on email only, but Darlene, I think if you do have more questions, Jonathan Ali's contact is in the presentation, and so feel free to email him directly and he can provide some additional information. We have another question, which I didn't get up on there in time. Give me 1 second, Rob. Okay, F. Robert Leary, you are unmuted. And I can ask his question, he might not be able to have audio. So the next question is, I have a neighbor who has tested for PFOA above the limits allowed. Saint-Gobain has refused to reimburse them for a treatment system they had installed, whereas they do not have town water available. So I don't know if there was situations that arose during the interconnections. Yes, we can hear you. If there was situations that arose during the interconnections.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you might just want to turn down the audio on what you're listening to.
I have a neighbor who has actually 3 neighbors that have tested positive above the limit. I have a neighbor who has actually 3 neighbors that have tested positive above the limit. And Saint-Gobain has refused to reimburse them for water treatment services that they have. We do not have town water where we are. We're all on basically dug wells. And is there any recourse for these people to be able to get their money back, be reimbursed by Saint-Gobain?
Yeah, this is Mike Wimsat. Yeah, so in any circumstance like that, I think it'd be helpful for those folks to reach out to me and we'll talk about it, because the answer to that question may be very specific to each person and their particular circumstances. So I think the best way to address that is that, as Amy said, my contact information will be posted at the end of this, and it's in the handouts. And I would encourage them to just contact me directly, and we'll try to figure out what their particular issue is and see if we can help.
Thanks, Mike.
All right, thank you very much. I know there's a lot of people that are worried about that in the town here, that they want to put filtration systems in, whereas we're dealing with Pennachuck water systems, which most people are not very happy with them either. But there is a few stretches of area in this town that do not have town water, and they're concerned about the cost that they're going to have in order to get clean drinking water. So thank you very much. I'll look for your information and forward it to them.
Terrific. Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
So thank you very much. I'll look for your information.
All right, I'm just, yep.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you are unmuted. We got it.
Yes, I just wanted to add a little bit of an explanation when the question came as far as the person who was very satisfied with his well, and then he had to switch to town water, and now he's getting a monthly bill. There is a new law that's making its way through the legislature that would force any polluter to, in this case, it would be St. Gobain, to pay a monthly water bill for anybody who was forced to connect to groundwater or to city water for a period of 5 years. So that's currently making it, it's passed the House, it's now in the Senate. So hopefully it'll pass the Senate and be signed. And that would then result in any polluter, not just St. Gobain, but any polluter to pay 5 years of water bills. I know that's not ideal, but that's the best that we felt we could do at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. I'm aware of that bill, and actually I think the Senate committee exec on that bill today, and we referred it to committee. So the bill is still alive, so to speak, but it may not be acted on this year. Regardless of that, I'm glad you raised the question again, because there's one thing I wanted to say, and that is that while under state law and under the consent decree with St. Gobain, the agency is not asking or not requiring St. Gobain to pay water bills. But it's important for people to understand the consent decree that we entered into with St. Gobain is just that. It's an agreement between the state of New Hampshire and St. Gobain. And it did not take away anybody's rights to negotiate or demand or file suit or whatever choice or whatever pathway they might want to take on their own behalf. So in other words, just because the state of New Hampshire enters into a consent agreement doesn't mean that an individual party whose well has been impacted couldn't approach the company on whatever basis they chose to seek, what you described here, which is, contribution for paying water bills or that sort of thing. So it's important. I think a lot of times people think that the state's agreement limited their ability to take their own actions, and that is not the case.
Thanks, Mike. Joe Clark emailed in a question, and before I ask his question, if anybody else has any questions, please try to use the questions box. Joe is the last one I have so far. So Joe's question is, I live on a street in Litchfield where town water lines exist, but I am on a drilled well. I was not contacted by St. Gobain for testing and saw from the presentation that it was assumed that my address had a connection to water, town water. Question 1 is, am I eligible for testing? And question 2 is, if I test above the limit, is St. Gobain obligated to connect me to town water? Jeff, I think.
Yeah, I think I guess there's a lot of specifics to how that gets answered. So if he resides in an area that was addressed by the 2018 consent decree and lives at a property where the owner or previous owner might have declined connection to public water from St. Gobain, that would not be eligible for testing. But if he's outside the area where it was covered by the extension of public water, then he would be eligible for testing.
And then I guess the second part of that question, maybe that's more for Mike Wimsatt, is if I do test above the limit, is St. Gobain obligated to connect me to town water?
Yeah, so in general, if you are, inside the consent decree and your well is impacted above standards, and it's attributed to the releases from Saint-Gobain, as a general rule, there's an expectation that Saint-Gobain will need to provide you with a connection or some other means of safe alternate water. As Jeff indicated, there may be, certain circumstances at play here that make that answer a little bit more complicated to analyze. So once again, I think I would be happy to take a call from Mr. Clark offline and talk about the very specifics of his situation. We can figure out where he's located and what the history of that property is and see what opportunities are available to him.
Yeah, I'll just add that I take calls from residents with those types of questions all the time, and I can pull up your property on a map and really get into the specifics. So, certainly feel free to reach out to either myself or Mike.
All right. Well, I don't see any more questions coming in. Thank you. You're welcome, Joe. So if anybody from the audience has any more questions, feel free to put them in the question box, and I think we'll just take a minute here. And like we said, there, the handouts, hopefully you've found the handouts tab. It would be very in close proximity to where the questions tab is. And the end of the presentation also has everybody's contact here in front of you. And so now you kind of know their areas of expertise if you have any other questions that you think of after tonight.
Erin, I'm going to steal presenter from you.
Okay.
And I'm going to put up the contact information while we're just waiting out maybe a few more questions. All right, Erin, you can see that?
Yes.
Okay. All right, it looks like Kathy lost her connection, just so I don't think she's on.
Yeah. So we have no more questions coming in. So Amy, do you want to just close it up?
Sure. So what you're seeing is everyone's contact information that was here on the panel tonight. I'll leave it up for a few more minutes while we close everything, and I'll keep it up as people start to exit as well, just to give people some time. But we want to thank you for joining us tonight. And again, thank you for the opportunity to give you this update. And we thank the town of Litchfield for having us. And I hope that you all have a good evening. Mike, I don't know if you want to say a few words in closing.
Sure. Thank you, Amy. Yeah, I would echo Amy's thanks to everyone. And I just want to let you know that we, this crew here and a whole lot of other people work hard every day on this project. We keep at it. We've still got a lot of work to do, both in Litchfield and the other communities. And we're going to keep working at that until we're assured that everybody has access to safe, clean drinking water. So again, we tried to answer your questions as best we could. Some of them are pretty specific, so we've kind of deferred you to getting in touch with us afterwards, but we look forward to your calls and working with you. And as always, with this contact information, if you have concerns or questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. That's why we're here. So thank you again, and I hope everyone has a great evening.
So yeah, I think most people are off. So Amy, you can probably end the webinar.
Okay, will do.